So Tom Brady was almost a Dolphin, and he might have become an owner and a player. Is a wild thing. We got to talk about it here on the Locked On NFL podcast.
You are Locked On NFL, your daily NFL podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's going on, everybody? Welcome into the Locked On NFL podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm Luke Braun. I'm here on Tuesdays. I'm of Locked On Vikings, and from Locked On Commanders, Locked On Bucks, we got David Harrison in to talk about. I'm so glad I have you here because the first thing we have to talk about here on the Locked On NFL podcast, and thank you for making it your first listen or maybe first watch every single day, is this weird Tom Brady rumor. I think it's from Florio. And we're also going to talk a little bit of draft stuff. We're going to talk about maybe Malik Willis going higher than everybody has him. There was an interesting mock draft from Jordan Reid at ESPN that had him going number 2. We got to talk about that. And some other spicy draft takes. It's going to get more and more unhinged as this one goes on, as it always does here on Tuesdays on the Locked On NFL podcast. Let's talk about the Tom Brady thing. So as I understand it, Florio has been reporting on this, that there was some flirtation, I guess, between Tom Brady and the Miami Dolphins before Brady announced his retirement initially. And then he retired the day after the Brian Flores lawsuit dropped with the tanking and the like racism allegations and all of that stuff. And then that day he announced his retirement, and then 40 days after that he decided, well, maybe I will play. I'll just play for Tampa again. Did I get that right? And help me out. What is going on here? That's insane.
Yeah. So basically, I mean, the entire story is, as much as we can piece together from the quote unquote reports that have been put out there, is that at some point in time, Tom Brady met with the Dolphins ownership and they basically struck a deal that he was going to officially retire from the NFL, buy a minority stake of the Miami Dolphins. They would then approach the New Orleans Saints about trading for the rights to Sean Payton, make that trade, hire Sean Payton to be the head coach. Then Tom would approach the Buccaneers and say, listen, I'm now going to come out of retirement and play for the Dolphins, so I need you to trade me, basically my rights to trade for myself, trade himself to Miami, and then I guess become a player owner of the Miami Dolphins, which I'm not even sure is allowed anymore, to be honest with you. But that was basically the scheme that was cooked up. And Tom Brady's retirement on February 1st, the day that Brian Flores' lawsuit also dropped, was supposed to be, according to Florio, the first domino in this string of events that was going to happen. And then Flores' lawsuit basically kept all that from happening, because now they're embroiled in all this controversy and there's all these things going on. And then you see Mike McDaniel get hired later on, which is funny because Mike was actually asked at the owners' meetings if he had ever had any conversation with anybody inside the building about trading for Tom Brady. And he very emphatically was like, no, that's not going to happen. That's not going to be a thing. Well, if Florio's reports are true, it's because all this other stuff was lining up before Mike was ever talked about being a head coach of the Miami Dolphins. So of course he doesn't know anything or what isn't involved directly in it. Now, a lot of people are passing this off as conspiracy, conjecture, and all this other stuff. It's just very interesting to talk about. But then basically Tom, with everything blowing up with Miami, says, okay, fine. Well, I want to play anyway, so I'll come back. Basically got to suck it up and play with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. And now Bruce Arians retires, so that's where all those conspiracies tie. It's just it's an amazing thing. And one way or another, I think that the NFL fan, public, media, everybody involved in football deserves a 30 for 30 on what happened this offseason, because it's just very intriguing stories going around. And you know as well as I do, Luke, there's got to be, like, I'm not saying it's all true. I'm not saying that it was all like, a hair away from Tom Brady playing for the Miami Dolphins, but this story is coming from somewhere, and I want to know the source of where this thing starts.
Well, as a former Viking, current Buffalo Bill once famously said, there's truth to all rumors. Yeah. It's wild. Like, there's so much to process about it. Like, how would you work out in a modern day and age how a player ownership thing would work? But I guess it would be Tom Brady, right? And then it's like, wait, and Sean Payton maybe was going to, and then he just kind of retired instead.
Right.
Or halfway retired, because we all know he's coming back someday. And then like, how would that trade have worked out? Would Tampa have played along with this? Would they have really had a choice? As it's like how much. I think it really would have tested just how much command Tom Brady has over professional football. Yeah. Which, I mean, look, he is the GOAT. He's the guy. Like, if anybody has the ability to push the envelope of how much control a player can have, it's Tom Brady. But like, my goodness, that would have been insane.
Yeah, it's kind of. I would like to hear what. If this is all true, of course, I would like to hear what the speculated trades were going to be, because the Saints aren't going to give up Sean Payton without high draft capital in return. You're kind of looking at what John Gruden drew from the Buccaneers for the Raiders, and then same thing with Tom Brady. Like, I know he's older, and I know he's probably only got a year, maybe 2 left under his belt. I mean, it's Tom Brady; it could be 5, but the Buccaneers are still not going to want to let him go for, say, mid-round draft capital. You're still talking. Mm-hmm. So I mean, it's a lot of draft capital. The Dolphins don't get Tyreek Hill in this whole situation as well. So then his receiving group isn't really all that great either. And yeah, there's some free agents out there, but how many of them are really going to come to Miami just to play with Tom? Like, Devontae still goes to Vegas. You know what I mean? So like, it's just a weird scenario. I don't think it winds up with Brady having near the chance he has to ride off and sunset as champion like he does with the Buccaneers. But I mean, I guess. Mm-hmm. I mean, if it's all true, depending on what happens with the Flores lawsuit, I know other coaches are now joining in on it, and if it gets resolved by then, like if Tom Brady buys a minority stake of the Miami Dolphins in 2023, then maybe it just basically confirms. And by the way, Florio, his latest report, he unveiled that he did have secret sources inside the Dolphins organization confirming to him that all these things were taking place. So now, not only is he kind of standing by his claim and his story, but he's also saying that people inside the building are the ones that gave him the story. So that kind of adds a little bit more of a layer and maybe a little bit more credibility. But we know how these things work without a smoking gun, without, the Dolphins owner or GM or somebody coming out and saying, yes, this was going to happen, which is tampering. So it'll never happen. There's always going to be the group that doesn't believe it, the group that does believe it, and kind of the group where I sit, I think, where it's like crazier things have happened in the NFL world. For sure. You know what I mean? So I guess there's
this exact thing happened.
Yeah.
With Brett Favre. Like, he retired, and then he comes out of retirement, gets out of his contract, gets traded to the other conference, and then goes and plays for a rival. Like, it's Minnesota. The same deal. Yeah. I am familiar. They brought out the helicopter for him and everything. Yeah. And what's wild about it is all of that, if true, would have been breaking the rules, which we know the Dolphins don't have a problem with anyways. So I think that wouldn't be the first time. But just what's going on in that organization, from the tanking allegations and the lawsuit and all these people named, and what's going to happen with Stephen Ross, all of that stuff. It is a weird time to be a Miami Dolphins fan, especially because they've also gone out and done like the Tyreek Hill trade and all this other crazy stuff. And they're like building up this team that you don't know what you're actually going to see on Sundays. And it could be something way more exciting and is too. Like, there's so many questions around the Dolphins. They're just this like pure enigma right now. And hey, if you think you have an idea how that's going to turn out, why don't you go bet on it at Bet Online, where regular regular season win totals are up. You can bet on anything there. You could have been betting on the Masters if you wanted to. You can bet on pro basketball, pro hockey playoffs starting up for all that stuff right away here. You've got, I think there's a play-in game for the NBA like today on Tuesday as this releases. So that's super exciting. There's golf, tennis, MMA. You can even play your favorite Vegas casino games. All news, props, odds. You can even build your weird parlays in their player prop builder or bet on stuff live. Bet in the middle of games. So head on over to betonline.net. Get a gambling at BetOnline, where the game starts. So it's draft season. That means the Locked On NFL Podcast Network is doing some very, very cool stuff. We have the Odyssey Ultimate Mock Draft. We've been doing this for a couple of years now, where all of us Locked On hosts got together and did a mock draft representing our own teams. That is all very fun. Trades allowed, chaos allowed. Some really interesting surprises on that board. Really excited to share that stuff with you. And then we also have our live coverage. All 3 days, we are going to be covering the NFL draft live. So if you're sick of listening to Mel Kiper say outdated things, come listen to Locked On stuff instead. Maybe go check that out. You can find the Ultimate Mock Draft on Odyssey and also on the Locked On NFL Draft podcast feed. And you can find the live coverage on the Locked On NFL Draft YouTube page at 7 Eastern on day 1 of the draft, 6:30 Eastern on day 2 of the draft, and 11:30 a.m. Eastern on day 3 of the draft. Speaking of that draft, I want to talk to you about a mock draft, 7-round mock draft that's sort of taken the world by storm from Jordan Reid at ESPN. And he had an interesting thought about taking Malik Willis, number 2, to the Detroit Lions instead of them doing Kayvon Thibodeau or whatever. How do you feel about them going for one of these quarterbacks instead of maybe waiting till next year?
It's kind of a weird development that's happening just kind of recently. And, Jordan's not the first and he's not going to be the last. He's just kind of the most recent. Travon Walker out of Georgia was kind of one of the most recent fast risers. He's got him going number 7 in the New York Giants. But then there's, Malik Willis going to Liberty or going to Detroit from Liberty. I don't hate the thought process because if you're the Detroit Lions, like we all know what the Cincinnati Bengals did. And I think every NFL fan, they kind of get caught up in these Cinderella moments and stories and say, my team can do that. And I mean, I remember after the Buccaneers won the Super Bowl following the 2020 NFL season, a lot of people were saying, well, now everybody's going to try to copy the Buccaneers blueprints. Well, the Buccaneers blueprint was have the greatest quarterback to ever play the game be a free agent and want to come to your team. That's not, you can't duplicate that. You can't replicate that from any strategic standpoint. So when you're looking at the Cincinnati Bengals as well, I mean, there's no number 1 quarterback that was selected a year or 2 years ago that has a number 1 caliber wide receiver coming out of the draft this year. So it's kind of an enigma. And then you look at the Los Angeles Rams, and that's why, Russell Wilson's getting the capital. Even Carson Wentz, you can probably tie the Carson Wentz trade and how much the Colts got for him to what the Rams were able to do with Matt Stafford, bring in a veteran and kind of resurrect their career. But with Jared Goff, I think the Lions,
he has to earn his first name.
Yeah, I think we've pretty much all seen enough to know that Jared Goff is not going to elevate a roster anytime soon. So if you're the Detroit Lions, if you're being real, you're not going to duplicate what the Bengals did. You're probably 2 or 3 even seasons away from really being towards the top of that division. And that's what you have to do first, right? Win the division first. But you do have Goff for 2 more seasons. So you bring in Willis, who, again, has been on record to teams himself, saying that he knows he's not ready to start in the NFL in year 1. But can you get a talent like Malik Willis in 2 years if you're Detroit in the first round of the NFL draft? That is not a given. What is a given is you can get him now this year, continue to stack talent around the quarterback position with later round picks, probably still be in the top 5 to top 10 range next year and maybe even the year later, put even more top talent, blue chip talent around Malik Willis, insert him as a year 3 or year 4 quarterback. And if he even hits on 80% of his potential that everybody sees, you probably have a playoff contender in Detroit finally.
Yeah, look, long-time Locked On NFL listeners know I am not a fan of the Detroit Lions. I cannot stand how content the Lions. Now I'm not talking about Lions fans. Lions fans, you deserve better, and you should be storming Ford Field with torches and pitchforks every day because they are content with not being good. And that's really where I have, like, they have fallen into this rut where they're like, we'll just go with Jared Goff, I guess. And I know Brad Holmes is like weirdly the only guy in the league super sold on Jared Goff. I get it. But I think moving on is a good thing for them. The problem is, I don't know how you take a guy like Malik Willis, who needs a year. Mm-hmm. How do you nurture a developmental prospect like that with a roster like the one the Lions have? Yeah. Looking at quarterbacks like that who have worked out, the Josh Allens and Patrick Mahomeses of the world, right, that came out super raw. They had a roster around them. They were nurtured and supported when they were, and Mahomes didn't even start his rookie year. Josh Allen started and it was horrible and nobody cared because we all knew it. Right. But he had talent around him and they've been able to stack talent around him. My question is, if you're going to draft a quarterback right now, will you be able to put an elite roster around them by year 2?
That is
not with the Lions, right? Like that's impossible. For the Bills and Chiefs when they did their thing. Yeah, like that's just impossible. Right. So sure, take your stab at quarterback, right? That's the thing that can turn a franchise around and it's everything. But you can't just take Malik Willis and say, okay, problem solved. You have to nurture him. Getting the ceiling of Malik Willis, like the task of acquiring what you think Malik Willis can be, does not end with drafting him second overall. You have to be able to unlock that talent as well. And I just don't know if the Lions are equipped to do that. I see it more going the Justin Fields route, where he struggles and he's not nurtured. And, now how's he going to develop? And you have all these questions. You have to get your ducks in a row before you're ready to do that. Otherwise, you're just wasting years of the rookie contract toiling at 5-12 while you look toward, hey, maybe in 2 years we can have a future. That ain't it.
Absolutely. And hey, look, maybe the Detroit Lions are kind of helping push this narrative and this idea because they're looking for somebody to jump up to number 2 to get Malik themselves and give them some more draft capital as they trade back. That would be the smartest thing Detroit has done since freeing Matthew Stafford to Los Angeles. One of many draft takes, Luke, and we've got more draft takes to talk about. We're going to share some of ours. We're also going to pull up some very interesting draft takes inspired by Doug Farrar of USA Today Sports. And we're going to do so thanks to our friends over at rockauto.com. With the ever-increasing number of makes and models of vehicles, it is literally impossible for your local parts store or your dealership to stock every part you're going to ever need, and especially the brands that you might want or target on your shopping list. Instead, you're going to wait while they search their computer, find the parts they happen to carry in their warehouse because they probably get a little bit of an overhead deal on carrying those parts, and that's what you're going to be stuck with. Or you can go to rockauto.com, because if you have access to a computer or a phone or a friend's computer or a friend's phone, then you have access to one of the most comprehensive auto parts stores on the internet. Why spend 30, 50, even 100% more for the same parts at a chain store dealership that you can find at rockauto.com, a family business serving do-it-yourselfers for over 20 years, and their prices are reliably low for every customer, not just professional mechanics. So go to rockauto.com right now, see all the parts available for your car or truck. Right, Locked On in there. How did you hear about us box? So you know that we sent you. Amazing selection, reliably low prices, all the parts your car will ever need at rockauto.com. Final segment here at Locked On NFL podcast. Luke Braun, also the host of the Locked On Vikings podcast. David Harrison here, subbing in for the great Ross Jackson, host of the Locked On Saints podcast. You can find me at Locked On Commanders or Locked On Bucks. A lot of Locked On happening on this episode, Luke, and a lot of hot takes happening over on Twitter, specifically in the thread started by Doug Farrar, again, of USA Today Sports, at NFL_Doug Farrar. That's Farrar. If you don't already follow him, you should be. We've seen this and his books. You should be checking out his books as well. We've been seeing this trend on Twitter lately, Luke, where it's like, we're canceling people today over breakfast take. So what is your most cancelable breakfast take? Well, Doug kind of mimicked it, but then twisted it. What's your most heretical draft opinion this year? And I think I'm saying that right, where basically it's what's your most ridiculous draft take this year? And he put in parentheses, I would have ranked a healthy David Ojabo above Aiden Hutchinson. So let's get into a couple of these, and one that's very popular. Well, actually, first, Luke, let's talk about that one. David Ojabo, Michigan edge rusher, over Aiden Hutchinson, edge rusher from Michigan, who is very, very wide and large, thought to be the most likely number 1 overall pick of the Jacksonville Jaguars. What do you think about that take started by Doug?
So the first time I looked at the Michigan D-line, I was looking at both of these guys, and it was before Ojabo got hurt. And I remember, and I was way too chicken to put it out there, but I remember thinking, like, I kind of like the other dude more.
Yeah.
And like, here's my deal with Aiden Hutchinson is it seems to me like he needs to kind of string together. I was telling you before the show, he needs to string together like a 4-move Hadouken combo to get by a guy. And he does that, and he's very polished at it, and he's got, pass rushers with a plan, and he does all this really cool stuff, and it's very exciting, and he gets a lot of wins off of it because he can string together a 4-move Hadouken combo, and it's very difficult to defend that. But it's also, I don't know, just like very delicate and fragile. And if it gets disrupted, it can fall apart. And he's not like, I don't see him often enough just get up and bend around a guy. It's never an easy win. And I feel like, sometimes like it feels like he has to work so hard that when you get up against NFL tackles, is that going to be available to you? And that's sort of the issue I have with Aiden Hutchinson, and it's why I kind of don't think the Jags should do it first overall. I mean, that's still like minus 300 at BetOnline, so it seems like he's going to be the first overall pick, and I just don't agree with it.
He tweeted that out 6:07 p.m. April 11th, so I'll even give you a timestamp on that. But Luke, before we get out of here, let's give our draft takes here that might be a little bit cancelable.
Oh yeah, you're going to cancel me over this one. I think only one wide receiver in this draft is worthy of being a first round pick, and it's Garrett Wilson.
Yeah. Yeah, you mentioned this before we recorded, and I'm not going to cancel you for it, but I'm very interested to hear the logic.
So here's the other guys that I see kind of typically mocked in the first round are Chris Olave, who is a very polished possession wide receiver 2 type. He just doesn't strike me as the game changer, the offense warping player that you're typically looking for in a first round wide receiver. You're looking for a Devontae Adams that you can build around. And Chris Olave seems like he can be a very effective piece of the machine, but that's a second round guy to me, which there's no shame in, by the way.
Right.
Jameson Williams, total burner, right? He's got sea speed, but of course there's the ACL. I don't think many people would argue with me there. It's like, hey, ACL, you're probably not going to take an injured guy in the first round, right? And you don't know how he's going to recover. If the speed is such an important part of his game, is that going to be okay? You just don't know. And so he could totally work out, be the best receiver in this class, but I'm not going to risk a first rounder on it. I'm going to make a smaller bet if I'm going to take him. And then there's Drake London, who to me just reminds me of Laquan Treadwell coming out in all the worst ways. He's just a guy that had to make too many contested catches. Look, his tape is really interesting because there are a lot of times where he did generate separation and his quarterback Clovis just didn't throw it right. And so it kind of brought the DB back into play. He had to make a contested catch. But I see a lot of his highlights are more about physicality, and they aren't running routes. They're fade routes, and he's boxing guys out and stuff. You don't get away with that in the NFL, especially in a world where most quarterbacks in the NFL, like my team's quarterback, Kirk Cousins, will never throw the covered guy a 50-50 jump ball. It's just not their game. And so unless you have like a super YOLO guy like Josh Allen that just kind of doesn't care, like it's going to be really difficult to find success that way when you're that style of receiver. And if you look at the kinds of receivers that have come out lately that have been that style of, well, he doesn't get open, but he can box you out. Those guys are like, the hit rate is abysmal. So I don't buy it. I'm into Garrett Wilson. I don't mind Garrett Wilson. I think if he came out in 2020, he might have been like the 7th wideout off the board, but that was a crazy draft class. But I just don't like any of these wide receivers.
Yeah, I mean, I agree to a certain extent. I do think that Garrett Wilson is benefiting from, one, the Jameson Williams injury, and two, the fact that while it's a very deep wide receiver class, there's not like the Randy Moss home run hitter, the Calvin Johnson, you know what I mean, type of guy out there that you kind of look for and say he's a future Hall of Famer in your evaluation. To your point about Drake London, I mean, a lot of comps, and he's even said himself that he kind of models his game after Tampa Bay Buccaneers wide receiver Mike Evans. And that's a good guy to model your game after if you're Drake, because you're built like him, you're slow like him. You don't get, I'm saying NFL slow. I couldn't beat Mike Evans in a race anything, but
relatively.
And not a lot of separation in your routes and all those things. But here's the thing about Mike Evans, right? So Mike Evans, first of all, he's a record holder. He's the NFL record holder for most consecutive 1,000-yard receiving seasons to start a career, beating Randy Moss's record. Now, he doesn't get the accolades because he's not as sexy, he's not as splashy as Randy Moss. Most of his yards have been done through grinding and hard work and not a lot of run after the catch, to be quite honest with you. But there's really not a lot of Mike Evans type receivers in the NFL right now that are having success. So Mike Evans is kind of the exception to the rule, not the rule. And when you look at Drake London, is he going to be the exception, or is he going to be the Laquan Treadwell, to your point? And do you want to spend a first-round pick on finding out, or do you want to save your picks and get Drake London in the second, or get a Christian Watson who has just as many potential questions around him as a guy like Drake London does, just because of where he came from out of college and all these other things? I think, or, a Calvin Austin III, or a Sky Moore, or a Jalen Tolbert. Like, there's so many high potential guys in day two that I could see teams passing on wide receivers on day one because of these concerns. And then Treylon Burks is actually the last name I'll bring up in this part of the conversation, because I was once higher on him than most people are now. Now I think a lot of people are higher on him than I am, which is a weird shift in dynamic. Real quick, my maybe fanatical take in this whole thing, Luke, is that Kaiir Elam, quarterback out of Florida, is DB, or is cornerback number 2 behind Ahmad Sauce Gardner. It's not Andrew Booth Jr., it's not Derek Stingley, it is Kaiir Elam.
So are you of the mind? I mean, look, every single mock in the world has Stingley going to the Vikings, so I'm very steeped in Stingley. Are you of the mind that like you're just too worried about his absence in the last 2 seasons, and just like we haven't seen him really play consecutively? Is that the reason, or is there something in his actual tape that is knocking him down for you?
It's
and then tell me more about Kaiir Elam.
Right, it's the inconsistency paired with the fact that we haven't seen much of him. So it's a little bit of an unfair evaluation, because this young man hasn't really had the opportunity to prove those inconsistencies wrong, and that they were the exception to the rule versus what you're going to get in the player. We know he has the raw tools, the athletics, but do you draft a guy based on workouts or do you draft a guy based on tape? And every scout that I've ever talked to, every former GM that does an interview, every head coach, what do they always say? You always go back to the tape. And Derek Stingley's tape is just inconsistent. And those years away, he could have matured, and some of those are because of immature decision making and all that. I get that, but those years away could have improved that. But also, those years away could have degraded some of his actual ability and some of those things. I love the kid from a competition standpoint. I think he's a very competitive young man. I just think when you're looking at investing a first round pick, Kaiir Elam, he doesn't have a lot of some of the sexy production, but you've got the tools, you got the athletic traits, and you can see some of the ability that you need in NFL corner on his tape. Now you just need to make sure you have the coordinator and the coach to go out there and get him and make sure that he's in the right position. The question I would have with Kaiir is he going to be receptive to that coaching, or does he think he has it figured out already? Because we all know a lot of times in this league, guys that fizzle out, it's not because of their talent, it's because of their mentality. If Kaiir Elam is open to coaching and open to a guy saying, look, give me all the tools you have, let me show you how to use them to make this masterpiece, then Kaiir Elam is easily, to me, the top two corner in this year's class.
I hear you. It's a ceiling thing. Look, tomorrow Tony and James are coming around. They're going to keep all these conversations going. Make sure you subscribe to the Locked On NFL Draft podcast feed. Especially that's where the Ultimate Mock Draft's going to be. Make sure you tune into the YouTube channel there as well for the live show on actual draft weekend. For David Harrison of Locked On Bucks and Locked On Commanders, I'm Luke Braun of Locked On Vikings. Thanks for hanging out on the Locked On NFL podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.